In the show Dexter, there's a character that they reference multiple times, and according to Dexter, this other character is the only thing that makes him feel alive, and that's his dark passenger. But you'll never see a credit for them at the end of the show, nor will you see them on screen. Or will you? But before we get into that, what is Dexter's dark passenger? In the show we see that Dexter and his brother were present for their mom's brutal and untimely end. And the horrible things that they saw inside of this shipping container forever changed Dexter and his brother Brian. And we see that both of them, even with very different upbringings, still ended up being serial criminals, taking the lives of people and also sectioning and cutting them up, just like what happened to their mother and others in that shipping container while they were present. And in the show, they take a psychological approach to it, that Dexter's dark passenger is because of the trauma that he faced, and that his dark passenger is these psychopathic thoughts and feelings that he's having, like his urge as a young boy to hurt other people and to hurt animals. And as he gets older, we see that he starts acting these things out at a very young age, to which Harry develops the code, because he thinks that the traumatic things that happened to Dexter early in his life will translate into him being a serial killer. So Harry thinks that he's mitigating the disaster that someone like Dexter could cause by trying to focus him in on people who slip through the cracks of the justice system. And this is so Harry can try to keep him safe, but also Harry unconsciously wants him to take out the people that he failed to bring down with the justice system. And this personal motivation of Harry's might be why Dexter ended up the way he did. Now, it's possible that Harry was always correct and Dexter would have always become a criminal, but he started training him to hurt people when he was at a very young age. And he's at an age where people still do show things like conduct disorder. And so we have something called labeling theory, where if you label a person, then they might become that thing that you've labeled them as. That's why we have some different terms for child criminals versus committing that same crime as an adult. It's so that that child doesn't believe that they're going to grow up to be that thing, and they're less likely to become it. And so we see that Harry was always checking with Dexter at a very young age if he remembered the horrible things that happened. And every single time he showed a sign of it, Harry would start to freak out. So Dexter knew at a young age he had this potential to be this destructive and evil force in the world. But we see that Harry might not have helped Dexter. So in the show we have this very interesting dynamic where we understand that this is psychological, but we don't really know if it's a chicken or the egg kind of situation. And then as the seasons progress, we see that Harry was also working with someone who was pushing him to get Dexter to start doing these things, and that Harry was pushing back, and at a certain point he didn't want to do it because even though these people are criminals, he realized that they shouldn't be brutally killed. That's why he believes in the justice system, and this will come back in just a minute. So while the show doesn't go too much deeper into what Dexter's dark passenger is outside of psychological complications from the awful things that he experienced as a child, that's not the case when we look at the books that the show was inspired by. The first book in this series was called Darkly Dreaming Dexter, and its sequel, the second book, was called Dearly Devoted Dexter. And for these first two books, they really didn't discuss much about what is the dark passenger outside of what we kind of know from the show. But in the third book, Dexter in the Dark from 2007, they actually go into the history of the dark passenger. In the book, it's explained that there are these entities that are similar to what people might call a demon. And in this book, they even say that Dexter's dark passenger might be a child of the ancient god Moloch. And in the book, it's explained that these dark passengers, or these demons, that they've existed all throughout time, even before humans existed. And they like chaos and to hurt and to kill. And so these entities would go around and try to find living organisms that they could infest or possess, and they would make them do these horrible things, like taking the lives of other living beings or making them suffer. And over time, these entities, they started moving into more and more advanced species as they evolved, and they really liked humans because we have the capability to do so much harm. Because they want to hurt things, they ignore that we have great potential for good as well. And that when people experience very traumatic moments, it creates these kind of cracks in them, and then these entities can slip in and try to convince them to do these dark things. Which does fall in line with the TV show Dexter, because he talks about how he lets the dark passenger take control. And he does this because it's the only time that he truly feels alive. But in order to get that sensation, he has to go do the horrible things that his dark passenger wants him to do. And so in the book, we understand that there are a lot of these entities, and that these entities are very sentient. In the book, Dexter goes to a crime scene, and there's something about this crime scene. The person who committed this crime, their dark passenger is so scary and powerful that Dexter's dark passenger leaves his body. So throughout the book, he actually does not have his dark passenger, and we see that he can't do a lot of the things that he normally does. He's not as confident, he can't take control of things. And in reality, Dexter has always been capable of the things that he does. He's let his dark passenger take the wheel of the car for so long that he doesn't remember how to steer it. And in the book, they also talk about how that her previous relationship, her husband was a terrible person and he used to beat his wife and children. And he would control all of them with domestic abuse. So Rita and her children were very battered. But Cody, her young son, like Dexter, he didn't remember all of the horrible things that happened to him as a child. And in that third book, you understand that he might have a dark passenger too. Now, this whole dark passenger actually being a physical entity in the third book was not popular with audiences, and people complained so much that the author, Jeff Lindsey, actually retconned that for future books in the series. But I still consider the idea that he does have this dark entity as canon for the books, because that was the author's original intention, and he only went back and changed it because people got so mad, but those people were only mad because they were basing it off of the TV show, which was inspired by the book. But in the books, he is very much possessed by what you might call a demon or some kind of ancient god. And in the book, just like in the TV show, he doesn't like to say no to this dark passenger because he likes the feeling when it makes him do the things that it wants to do. But that's because Dexter doesn't understand that he's being manipulated by the dark passenger. In his mind, they're working together, but that's not the case at all. Dexter's dark passenger only cares about itself. We see that in the book series when it runs away from him when it's scared of another dark passenger, leaving him vulnerable to this other dark passenger that's even more powerful than his. And while the show does have this, where this is a psychological effect from the trauma, it almost feels like somewhere in the background there is this idea of it being some kind of entity. And that's because throughout the show we do have a physical manifestation of his dark passenger, but Dexter doesn't realize that that's what it is. And that's because Dexter's dark passenger is Harry. And I don't mean the real Harry in his real life. I mean the Harry that he hallucinates. And this makes me think that Dexter's dark passenger in the TV show might be an entity just like it is in the book. But he never discovers that. Early in the show, we only see Harry through flashbacks. But later on in the show, we see Harry in flashbacks, as well as a physical embodiment of Harry that sits down and has conversations with Dexter. On the surface, it seems like because Dexter doesn't have empathy, he's created this Harry inside of his head that is his empathy. It's his moral compass. And he tries to imagine the things Harry would have told him. But we see that the Harry in his head and the Harry from flashbacks or the ones in the tapes present two very different people. The Harry who he hallucinates, that might be his dark passenger, this one is always telling him how to get away with his crimes. It's always trying to keep him from getting caught, but it does encourage him to keep doing these things, telling him consequences that might happen if he does or does not go through with taking the lives of some of these people. But later on, when Deb watches Evelyn's tapes of Harry, we see that he was very disturbed when he actually saw what Dexter was doing and how proud he was. And he said that nobody deserved to be cut into pieces when he was talking about a criminal. And so even though Harry was a very flawed man, with the cheating on his wife, sleeping with an informant, training his adopted son to do these things, as well as how he ignored Deb, and how he took Dexter away from Brian and left this kid inside of a cargo container alone. We know that Harry wasn't a good person, although he probably thought he was. But still, the actions of Harry, they don't line up with Dexter's hallucinations of Harry. And the Harry that Dexter sees is only concerned with getting away with it and so they can get to the next crime. And that's because this Harry that he's hallucinating, he's not his morals or this physical manifestation of Dexter trying to hold on to the morals of Harry. This physical representation of Harry that we see, this hallucination, that is actually Dexter's dark passenger manifesting. Because his dark passenger is manifesting as the thing that he trusts the most. And we see throughout it that Dexter does have hallucinations a couple times in the show. And this is exactly what's happening every time Harry is manifesting. That is actually his dark passenger presenting itself as Harry because it knows that Dexter always listens to Harry. And because Dexter would not want to do things because of the code, but now the dark passenger disguises itself as Harry and speaks through him and his words so that Dexter will listen. And so that he doesn't actually weigh these things and think about the code that he was given because he thinks that this version of Harry in his head is saying that it's okay. And while we do see this manifestation of Harry sometimes telling him not to do things, it's because the dark passenger doesn't want to get caught. It wants to keep going and have longevity. Just like in the book, how we know that these entities, they've existed before humans and all throughout our history. And because they like to cause destruction and explore their violent tendencies, it would learn over time that if it wants to keep going and getting away with its crimes and not have to restart with a new body over and over, that it needs to make sure that the vessel it's chosen does not get caught. And so when the dark passenger manifests as Harry, its only concern is getting what it wants. It wants to go commit more violence, and it doesn't want to get caught for it. And so it likes this idea of the code, where it can go after criminals that people aren't going to go looking for very hard. Horrible people that if they go missing, nobody's going to look too hard. Not the police and not their families. So in the book series, they do outright say that this is a supernatural phenomenon, these are entities, and that people are basically possessed by them. But in the show, they chose not to talk about it. But I do think in some ways they kind of left it up to interpretation, and this manifestation of Harry not really aligning with the Harry that we see in flashbacks or in the tapes, and that contradiction between what we see and what Dexter sees, it really does leave it open to this actually might be an entity that has possessed Dexter. But I would love to hear your ideas down in the comments. And also let me know if you've read the book series and you like them. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on the way out. I have a members only section as well as a Patreon and a TikTok. So go ahead and check all of that out. I got links down in my bio. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments and what you want to see next. And I want to thank you all so much for being here. I'll see you in the next video. You should check out this video right here. I don't know what it is. I haven't figured out what I'm going to put there yet, but you should check that one out.